From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. This episode of Blue Sky features a guest with a truly remarkable story. His bio will largely unfold for you as we talk. And as you'll hear, he was living what he considered to be a dream life. He was married to his high school sweetheart, had Ivy League degrees, was a senior executive at a prominent Wall Street firm, and had 5 great kids. But everything changed one night when they realized, in terrifying fashion, that their youngest child, son Stevie, had a serious and dangerous addiction to alcohol. We'll refer to my guest today as Steve D, to protect the anonymity of his son, Stevie. Steve will tell us about the profound impact his son's addiction had on their family and how it changed his own life's trajectory dramatically and completely. You'll hear how Steve and his family were nearly torn apart by Stevie's struggles and their challenges in addressing them, and also how Steve's relentless sense of hope and optimism helped him get through these daunting days. And you'll be amazed by how well he and his family have emerged from their many challenges. Before we begin our conversation, I want to caution that some of this subject matter might be very difficult for some of our listeners, as it includes frank talk about severe addiction and suicide. And now, my conversation with Steve D. Steve D, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Well, it's great to be here, Bill. Thank you for having me.
I've done a lot of research in preparation for this. You've been very open and honest with your story online and wrote a series of essays that we'll talk about in a bit. And I'd like to set the picture for folks. If we go back several years, describe what you and your life was like before this night when you found out about the challenges that your son Stevie was having.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question, Bill. So I was living what I would call a fantastic life. I married my high school sweetheart. We wanted to raise a family. We had 5 amazing kids, all seemingly doing well. I worked on Wall Street. I worked at a firm called Morgan Stanley. I was there 30 years. I was on the management committee. I ran global businesses. By all accounts, things were amazing. I was blessed, and I knew I was blessed. And so I was very thankful for the way my life had been going. And of course, the most important thing in my life was my kids. And they were it seemed they were thriving, all except for the youngest one, who's, kind of in some ways has changed my life. I would honestly say he's changed my life for the better in a lot of different ways.
So this night, you and your wife are watching Saturday Night Live, and there's a noise outside, and your son comes home, and you realize that he has gotten to the point of alcohol addiction, to the point where he was trying to take his own life. Can you describe how your world got upended that night and the immediate aftermath? Yeah,
so I'll step back a little bit. We knew that he was troubled. We knew that he was hurting. We knew that he drank alcohol to excess, much differently than our other children who experimented. We just didn't know what to do about it. And so we tried a bunch of things like grounding him and just things like that. But we had no way of getting our arms around it or controlling it. And flash forward to that night, and, we're just sitting there. I will say we were on pins and needles on, Friday and Saturday nights when our son would go out. But this was different. He stumbled in. He was incoherent, honestly, but he was crying. He was unbelievably upset. And we just kept asking him, like, what's going on? What happened? What? We had no idea. Did he have a car accident? Did somebody get hurt? And then he told us the story. And the story was that he was so depressed, he was so low that he tried to take his own life and literally was lying on a railroad track when a passerby, happened to be a friend, saw him and pulled him off the tracks. And he was so inebriated that the likelihood that he was going to wake up and save himself was pretty low. And so, he would describe it today as, a miracle. And honestly, I'm so glad that my life has changed the way it has changed and not in that way, because it's the most devastating thing that could ever happen to any parent. And, we were spared.
Wow. And he was 16 at the time, I believe. And the person who introduced us, Steve, described you as the most optimistic person he knows. So the most optimistic person that this person, who knows a lot of people, knows, has this happen to them. How have you responded, in the near term from that and in the years since?
Yeah. So honestly, it was devastating. And, that person maybe is right. Maybe it's, maybe I'm lucky that I'm the most optimistic person in his life. But generally speaking, I am a can-do, optimistic human on every level, except in this situation, I just didn't see a way out. I mean, my kid was very, very sick. He had deep depression. He had anxiety. He had an alcohol use disorder that he couldn't control. And I saw no path where he could live a great life. And it was very difficult to see a path where he was going to survive. He had 4 near-death experiences by the time he was 17. And so this was real. It was scary. And I'll say it straight up. I did not have any optimism whatsoever that he could find a way, the family could find a way out of this mess. And the good news is I was wrong. In the one situation where I was not optimistic, it turns out that there was lots of things. There's treatment. There are unbelievable professionals. There are unbelievable resources. And we got really lucky and we tapped into some great resources. And, my son is living proof that I should have been optimistic. He's 7.5 years sober. He's got 1 million friends. He's very social. He's really happy. He's not depressed. He's got a great job. He's a leader. I mean, I was dead wrong. So, in this one case where I wasn't optimistic, I'm really glad I was wrong.
So what were the steps that started to build you all back up? And you got, as a family, it seems you got, if you will, worse before you got better, right? From that realization. So what were the things that slowly helped you? Was it, because I know you've talked about parent groups and...
Yeah, finding treatment is the biggest thing that happened. So, a lot of people think they can handle this on their own. I was one of them, right? At Morgan Stanley, I was the can-do guy, fix the broken business, build the business that needs to be built, solve the complex problems. And I probably had too much belief in myself that, we'll deal with this. Once we got professionals on the team, so it was an outpatient clinic, that was the first big step for changing the game. But what I didn't realize was that part of what needed to happen was I needed to change as a parent. And it became very obvious as the counselors and other experienced parents kept pushing on me saying, look, you're letting him get away with this. You're letting him get away with that. You're solving all of the things that he's broken. You're cleaning up the mess. Why would this kid ever change if you keep making life easy for him? And so it took me about 6 months to get it, to get that I needed to change as a parent, and I needed to stop being his friend and, to start doing very, very difficult things like saying no, like saying you're responsible for this, letting natural consequences happen in school where, things weren't going as well as they should have been going. And, I wasn't running interference as a parent. And what that did was it started to give him a vision that what he was doing and the way he was doing it wasn't going very well. And so that's the hard part about addiction. There's this unbelievably beautiful research that's done on the stages of change. And one of the haunting lines in it is that it's not that they can't see the solution when they have this problem, it's that they can't see the problem. And so my job was to help my kids see the problem. And that was a new thing for me because, I was very protective of my kids, so that was a really, really big step.
It's impossible to truly understand what this all must have been like for Steve and his wife. But his frank and detailed description of events helps us try. And whether you believe in miracles or not, the chances of having a friend find and save Stevie were slim. So it's a remarkable story. As we think about what it takes sometimes to be an optimist, it's helpful to realize that regardless of your day-to-day outlook, bad things are going to happen. At first, Steve figured he was a fixer and he could handle it. But it wasn't until he let his guard down to truly see the problem and seek professional help that he began a path towards his son's recovery. I next asked Steve to talk more about the challenges parents face when confronted with a situation as dire as their son's. I think one of the things that can happen to a parent very, very understandably is once the situation includes potential self-harm, you're that much more scared of taking the hard line, right? It's like, oh gosh, if I really give him a hard time or if I let him, struggle with this, who knows what could happen, right? It seems to me that's one of the toughest things. I heard a woman speak, in her case, her child had an opioid addiction, and she would routinely sort of pull him out of the park where he was passed out. And finally one night she's like, I'm not going to the park tonight. And that her kid needed that, but that's so hard.
Yeah. So I'm not going to give anybody advice on this because it's so personal and each situation is different. And I would recommend that people really consult with professionals. But in our case, and I've seen it in a lot of cases, the child, the kid knows that the parents are scared. And so they use it against them. So in my case, when we said to my son, he had just gotten out of the psychiatric ward, for, suicidal behavior. And when I told him you're not going away, but you're going to outpatient treatment, 3 days a week, and it might interfere with soccer practice and your life, et cetera, he shut his bedroom door, he locked it, and turned on the shower. So there I am telling him, giving him the bad news. And the first thing that happens is, I have no sight and no hearing. I have no idea what's going on. And so I'm on my heels like, oh my God, I need to reconsider. And so that what you just said, when you're in these groups, in these meetings, no one ever talks about the downside, like what could happen. And so it only got to the point with my child where the downside of me not doing something different was perhaps greater than the downside of, if I didn't do things different, then if he kept on that path without me trying to interfere with it, he wasn't going to make it. And so I got to the point where, it became clear that dad needs to step up. And as, when I finally confronted him and said, we're going to send you away to residential treatment, he disowned me. We thought he might run away. He might hurt himself. He might go on a bender. So it was the scariest thing I've ever done in my life was when I finally turned the page and said, I'm no longer going to enable this behavior. He was pissed because I was his ally. I was his friend. And he disowned me. He was furious with me, but it's what had to be done. And it ended up in our case. And I want to stress it's our case, not every case. It was a game changer.
Incredible. And I'll mention this a few times. These essays I've referred to are on addictionlessons.com, which I highly recommend to someone who's interested in this subject or concerned about something that's going on. And one of the things you also describe that happens to a lot of families in any similar situation, I think, is it starts to invade your whole family and your marriage. And you describe this idyllic life of high school sweetheart, and then you describe this was a marriage challenge. And so one of the things I wondered in reading that is how, and again, I know you're only speaking for yourself, but it could apply to others. How do you prioritize, right? Do you, because it's sort of like on the airplane when they say put the mask on yourself before helping others. You want to save your marriage, obviously, but you want to save your child. And how does that all come together for a parent in this situation?
Yeah, I actually think there's an elegant solution to this one, because I've seen it happen a lot. The source of our struggle was that both of us thought we were saving his life, and both were willing to let the marriage go to save him. So she wanted to chain him to the bed, and I wanted to have an open dialogue and have conversations and negotiate. And I thought that her behavior was going to force him to do something stupid. And she thought that I was allowing him to continue with the behavior, and neither one of us would give in because it was our son's life. So, and he knew it. So he played one off the other. So one of the things about addiction is they know the parents. They know if you don't like confrontation. They know if you're afraid. They know if the parents aren't on the same page. And they absolutely take advantage of it, and he did. So he would get us fighting and not paying attention to him. What ended up happening was, in this case, was the counselors kept saying, you got to be on the same page. It doesn't matter what page, be on the same page, so that you can't be, I know I'm a Wall Street guy, but arbitraged. You can't be, taken advantage of. And so what ended up happening was our four older kids had an intervention with us. They sat us down. I remember it like it was yesterday in our den, and they said, you guys aren't doing him any good, and you guys are going to get divorced, and you're going to blow up the family unless you start to change. You two need to get it together. And they were right. And so what I did, and I'm a decision maker, I'm making split second decisions on trades, and I'm so comfortable making decisions. I'm sure that I'm right, that kind of thing. And I decided that it's not going to work. She's not going to say, yes, you make all the decisions. So I decided I'll let her make all the decisions. What was amazing about that was I said, look, I'm going to support you. You make the decisions. I'll tell you what I think, but it's your call. She went from chaining him to the bed and went right to the middle immediately. And then we both embraced that, and he had no wiggle room. We were on the same page. We were on the same page around boundaries, around consequences, around everything. And she made the call, but I give her all the credit in the world. She didn't just stay in her lane. She went right to the middle and did the compromise thing. And it was a big, big deal. And if you ask him today, if parents ask him, what can parents do better? He would say the first thing is get on the same page. Those are his words.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned siblings, because these things, they can be like wrecking balls swinging through the house, right? And everyone's in the way. And did the older siblings, you mentioned intervention, had they been in some sort of counseling that advised them to do that, or did they all just get together and just see this and say, we got to do something? That's incredible.
They're awesome kids. No, they weren't in counseling. A couple of things around the whole sibling thing. Stevie was in 11th grade. 3 of the older kids were in college, and 1 was out of college living in the city. And so I felt like they were protected because they weren't home for all of this, crazy behavior and fighting with me and my wife, but they knew. And so, yeah, they basically came home from college, 3 of them, on a weekend, and the 4th one was in the city. And they made it their priority because they knew that he was in a bad place. They knew we were in a bad place. And they made this intervention. The other thing I will say is, when he finally went away to residential treatment after a year of outpatient, they had a family education program. Everybody dropped everything. We all went out to this remote town in Pennsylvania, 3 hours away from New York City. And I mean, it all came out. My daughter kicked it off with her introduction and literally lamented how her baby brother and she were so tight, and now they didn't even talk. They didn't have a relationship. She started crying. There were 40 people in the room. Everybody started crying because they realized this is going on in everybody's family. So even though they seemed protected, they were not, because their baby brother was hurting, their parents were hurting. There was a lot of, dynamics that go along with addiction, which are pretty antisocial, with the person who's in active addiction. And it was painful. And they expressed that pain. So, for me, I just felt blessed that they weren't home, because the impact on them, if they were home and we were obsessed with this one sick child and, neglecting the other kids, it can be a really big, big problem.
These stories are all so powerful. It's easy to see why Steve describes standing outside his son's bathroom door with the shower running as the hardest thing he's ever done. And while many kids are good at pitting their parents against each other, people with Stevie's addiction challenges are often able to take it to the next level. And the older siblings coming home to do an intervention, not with their brother, but with their parents, tells you that this problem was tearing through the entire family. And it also shows how much they all cared about each other. Anyone who's raised children will also understand the importance of being on the same page with your spouse. And the story about Steve meeting in the middle with his wife is really interesting. Getting back to our conversation, I wanted to ask Steve more about family dynamics in these situations and how one goes from the worst of all scenarios to get to the other side successfully. I wonder, Steve, and I struggle probably with the right way to ask this question, but as you've lived this and learned so much about it and written about it and worked on it, and we'll talk some more about your work, do you think families in this situation almost have to go through this near rock bottom experience to get to the other side successfully? In other words, we can talk about trying to find this upstream and doing different things differently earlier, but do you sort of have to get driven down to your knees before you have success on the other side?
Well, I was on my knees. I'm still on my knees, but in thanks. But I don't think so. I don't. I think that you can raise the bottom, is the way they talk about it in the industry, because the bottom is really bad. So in some ways, my son's bottom was raised because, he didn't end up on the street. He didn't, end up with catastrophic things, thank God, happening. It was a struggle. He had 10 of the 11 DSM-5 symptoms. Like, he had deep, deep addiction. But, in some ways, getting him into treatment at 16, and then us learning what our role was as parents to be part of the solution while he was 16, I firmly believe raised the bottom. And it's not just in this one situation, it's in a lot of situations. The truth of the matter is that it's very difficult to see because there's a lot of excuses. Hanging out with the wrong kids, just going through a tough time, everybody parties. There's a million excuses. But, this thing called the DSM-5 for addiction, it's 11 yes or no questions. It cuts through all the BS and it tells you what you're really dealing with, whether it's no problem, a little problem, a medium problem, or, big addiction problem. I think that is, it's important for people to know, because you don't have to wait until they're really sick. And the other thing I will say is, I think that the harder cases are when the kids have been using heavily for a really long time. They're very, very sick. They talk about the brain restructuring and that there are different images of an addicted brain. The longer and the heavier you've been using, the sicker and more dependent you become. I think you want to intervene as early as possible, honestly.
It seems that a turning point for you and for a lot of people I know, even like nationwide and looking at the opioid crisis, is to realize that the addiction is a disease. And you have a slogan you use a lot, which is love the kid, hate the disease. And separating those two, I think, especially as a parent of a young child, and I would think in your case, the fifth of five kids, they're all doing well. And this, it's just like, oh, we quit drinking, you ground them, just stop kind of thing. But once you identify the disease and can separate that from the kid or the loved one of any stripe, it seems to me that's a big turning point. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, in the addiction lessons, I think it's story number 7, detachment is a parent's superpower. The thing about it is that, when somebody's in active addiction, it's a very selfish place for them to be, and they don't really care about blowing up relationships and doing things that are unacceptable. And so it's very painful as a loved one to see it happening, but also to be on the receiving end. So my kid, told me I was the worst father in the world. He disowned me. He said I was the reason why he was depressed. If it wasn't for me, he'd be fine. You can separate it out and say those are symptoms of the disease. That's addiction talking to me and not my kid. Then it creates a pathway where you're not going down this path of, wow, my kid's such a jerk, or, they're so mean to me. But you go down a path of, what can I do? He's obviously has this disease. What can I do to be a part of the solution? And so it's a self-preservation thing, but it's also it clarifies what's going on and what's not going on. So I think one of the biggest things, to figure out is what's actually happening in the house. And when a child is throwing, really hurtful things at you, it's really easy to emotionally respond and to get angry and to yell. And now you've lost the plot. The plot is the kid's sick and something needs to be done. And those are symptoms of the disease. So put those over on this side, and now let's work on what we can do to solve the problem.
And I think it's in the detachment essay. And if you're comfortable, would you mind me reading the letter that you wrote to addiction? It's brief.
Yeah, do it. Go ahead.
So this really struck me. So this is a letter that Steve writes, not to his son, but it's addressed, Dear Addiction, F you, triple exclamation point. You are trying to kill my son. You are trying to steal his future. You have turned him into a liar and a manipulator. You are trying to destroy my marriage and my family. I hate you with all the hate that a father can hate. But there is an antidote, and that antidote is sobriety. My son will beat you, and he will become the man he was destined to be. Your arch enemy, Stevie's dad. I'm not exaggerating. I just got goosebumps reading that again because I'm a dad. There's so much there, but I think the first thing is, though, now the anger that you have is directed appropriately, right?
So it was it was such a moment in my life, Bill. I was sitting there at the family education program, and the counselor said, "Okay, we want all the parents to write a letter from them to addiction." And I had all this pent up frustration and anger, and I didn't know where, in the process to send it, right? Couldn't send it at my kid because I loved him. I couldn't send it to my wife because I wanted to be married to my wife. Where can I send it? And it was this amazing moment. I wrote that in 2 minutes. It came out of me. And when I read it to the rest of the group, I think they thought I was crazy, but it actually elegantly lays out what you're dealing with and what the upside is. And, honestly, I think my son is becoming, who he was meant to be. And it was a big part of my ability to be a contributor that I understood this, that it was a disease that was trying to rob everything. His life, our relationship, my marriage, the tranquility in the family, everything. And it's so true in most families. It's a huge disruptor in the most negative way possible within a family structure.
Steve's advice here is pretty straightforward. You want to intervene early with a child who's struggling with addiction and get professional help as soon as possible. And the detachment concept is fascinating to me, and I imagine it'd be hugely helpful if you could get to the point where you can say, that's addiction talking, it's not my kid. And Steve's letter to addiction blew me away when I first saw it on addictionlessons.com, and even more so when I read it aloud to him. Getting back to my conversation with Steve, I wanted to get an update on how his son Stevie is doing today.
The interesting thing was, before addiction, he was the fun-loving kid, the little brother. All the older siblings would have their friends over, and he was everybody's little brother because he's hilarious. He's one of these kids where if you're having a baseball catch with him, you can't throw it to him. You have to throw it so he dives for the ball, or, it's just, everything is dramatic, and everything is him winning the World Series and, blah, blah, blah. Fun. So fun. Then it goes dark, and he blows up all his relationships with everybody, family, friends, parents, the whole thing. And addiction is the intruder. He gets, he kicks and screams, in all this recovery work. He didn't want to go, and at some point, probably a year and a half in, he embraces it and really identifies as a person in recovery. And from that moment, when he was okay with his identity being somebody who can't use drugs or alcohol and is working really hard on himself to be sober, from that moment is a straight shot where, he goes to college. He's sober for 4 years, except for the first week where he relapsed. But for 4 years at college, he has a lot of friends. He's incredibly social. He now has a longtime girlfriend that he lives with who's amazing. He's got a job in the industry, and he works at a sober living in New York City. He runs the men's programs. I recently went to, a fundraising event, and, I know a lot of people, and I was introduced all night as Stevie's dad because so many people know him, and he's such a force in the business. I couldn't be more proud of him. And, that's what he's supposed to be. He's supposed to be somebody who is making a difference in other people's lives. And that's what he's doing.
How old is Stevie now?
He's just turned 26. So he got sober at 18. He'll be 8 years sober in September.
And sort of going into the belly of the beast, if you will, and working in the industry as you describe it, some might think that's counterintuitive, that if you're going to try to stay sober, you should just move away from the subject of alcohol in his case, or that sort of thing. Or I suppose you dive right into it the way he has. Was that ever a concern or a debate with you all, or this is just, he knew he wanted to do this?
No, it's quite the opposite. A lot of so let me step back. We were fortunate to go to open AA meetings, anniversary meetings. There's one in New York City called the Atlantic Group. They have about 600 people. It's the largest one in the world. And you walk into that church on Park Avenue, and the energy, the youth, the gratitude, the empathy, the love for each other. It's such a human experience. it's absolutely amazing. And a lot of those people find meaning in helping others. And, that's the whole thing around AA. And by the way, it has scientific efficacy. There was a major study that was published in September of 20 by Harvard and Stanford, doctors. And, but it's about community. And so giving it back, paying it forward is part of the tradition of getting into recovery from that disease. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have guessed it. I didn't know any of this, before we got involved, but it's perfectly natural, that people do this. And, part of it is, my son, talks about what a daunting task it is to get sober. And it's such an important piece to talk to someone who's actually been through the same struggles and got to the other side. And that's why they're so valuable in the space, that he's been there, he's done it, he's gone, through all the trap doors, he's made all the mistakes, and you're going to benefit from his mistakes.
Right. And likewise with parents, I'm sure, you're sharing those stories. And
it's the same thing.
And so for you, Steve, I know your story, but if you could share with us, so this happens, you're in the middle of it, you're in this amazing job, and you change your energies or redirect them towards understanding this. You took a year at the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative, which is how you and I connected, to learn more about this. Could you tell us sort of the work you've been doing in those years since, and also, any thoughts you have for where you might direct folks who have similar challenges or concerns about their kids? And
Sure. So let me just start with, I didn't expect this one either. My mom, so I retired in 2016, but I made the decision in September of 15 after Stevie had his last relapse. And my mom said to me, I thought you were going to work at Morgan Stanley till you were 80. And that's kind of who I was as a human, right? That's what people thought. But so I've jumped in, I'm a longtime volunteer as a parent peer coach at Northwell Health. I work with families and the social workers, just sharing my story and the things that I've learned. I do have a podcast series for parents. It's called My Child and Addiction, that I did in partnership with two other fathers and a top treatment center, one of the top in the country. I did the website. I spent time at Harvard, in the ALI program studying addiction. I spent 4 years at a national nonprofit called Shatterproof, building educational materials and tools for families. What I would tell you in terms of parents, this is the biggest recommendations that I would make are, and then specific ones, but general ones. The first is, if you think there's a problem, get a professional diagnostic. Get professionals involved, because us lay people are really bad at this. We don't really know what addiction is and what addiction isn't. The second thing is, if your child does have a problem, in addiction, there's a number of things that parents need to do. I think the most valuable thing I've done, the most educational, the most important, the most groundbreaking, is to join parent support group meetings run by professionals. And, what's great about them is the professionals kind of lead the conversation in a certain direction to help the parents, but then experienced parents share. And there's nothing quite like a parent whose kid's life was on the line trying something that gives you the courage to try something, or not, but to at least think about trying a new approach within the household. And so, I, as a very, independent human, it was the last thing I was ever going to do. And now I proselytize that. The next thing I think is a really big deal is to actually take care of yourself if you're dealing with this. It's a marathon and not a sprint. I think in the stories, they talk about losing a lot of weight, and it was not because I was on a diet. It's because I couldn't eat. I'm not an anxious person. I had unbelievable anxiety around my son's well-being. I couldn't think. I couldn't do my job very well. And so and get educated, right? So, and all those things I was talking about are going to help you get educated. So those are the four things. The two, I spent 30 years on Wall Street. I got educated at some really good schools. My superpower, if I have one, or my most important strength, is I'm able to sort of take complex things and simplify them and then deliver them in a way that people can grasp quickly. That's why I wrote the website that I did, addictionlessons.com, because I didn't know anything and I had a hard time figuring things out. So that 40 minutes of reading, those 12 short stories, is the best of what I've learned that could be useful to parents over the 8-year journey that I've been on with my son, including the education at Harvard, including all the work that I do with Northwell, working with families, including creating educational materials for families at Shatterproof, all of that. It's the best of the best. So I think that's a great resource as a beginning. And then the other one is, it's very difficult to find these parent support group meetings. The podcast that we created is a live parent support group meeting with 8 parents like me, 8 experienced parents and a world-class clinician. And we just record it. The senior partner of the project has his own media company and his own sound engineers and all of that. So it's all done professionally really well. We have 200,000 downloads already. So with zero advertising. And, so that's really powerful. It's a great asset. And by the way, in addictionlessons.com, at the end, I have an entire resource section of free resources that I personally vetted that are really high quality and will be useful to parents and families. So those are specific, those are some general recommendations and specific recommendations.
I loved hearing Steve say that it's perfectly natural for Stevie to be doing the work he's doing today. And it's so great to hear how successful he's been at it. It's also remarkable to see the transition Steve D made, turning his seemingly boundless energy from his job on Wall Street towards working in the addiction recovery field. And for anyone in the audience who's dealing with similar issues or knows someone who is, the advice about getting peer support is really valuable, as is the idea that it's going to be a marathon, and while you work hard to help your loved one, you have to be sure you take good care of yourself at the same time. Getting back to our conversation, I wanted Steve to talk about what we know about whether addiction is genetic, possibly helping us catch these problems earlier in families with a history of these challenges. We don't hesitate in a doctor's waiting room to check off the box. Oh, there's cancer in my family. My dad had diabetes. I think we don't often ask that question, is there addiction in my family? And in some cases, I think it's societal too, where we just, oh, that's Uncle Louie, he's at it again, and then you look back and I was like, gee, maybe Uncle Louie was an alcoholic. Maybe he was an addict. Are there ways you suggest families to try to be honest about the potential and of a genetic predisposition? Is it helpful, or can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, here's the thing I'll tell you. The good news is the generation behind us is very open about a lot of stuff. And so I think it's really our generation and the older generation that sort of put all this in a closet and, doesn't really talk about it. So yeah, it's us. We need to be more open. The kids, my son was loud and proud, telling everybody, that he's got, as he said, when he was drinking and using drugs, it didn't go very well, which is the way he would describe it, right? So he's very open, very out there. Yeah, I think, look, the research says that 60% of your vulnerability or your risk factors come from genetics. But there's a couple of other things that I think are really important to mention. So yes, if there's drinking or drug issue within the family, you have a higher probability. But there's a couple of other things that I think are surprised me because I didn't know about them. The first one is age of first use. So in this country, there's a lot of rite of passage stuff. But if you start drinking alcohol at 14, your chances of developing an alcohol use disorder are 7 times greater, 700% greater than if you start at 21. And it's even higher for using drugs. So that age of first use is a big deal. Second one is, if you think about it, it's kind of obvious. It's people dealing with mental health issues, anxiety, depression, ADHD, trauma. And the reason is because people self-medicate. And in the beginning, it feels really good and it feels like a solution. And then it becomes an obsession and a negative spiral. But that's a big deal. And then obviously environment, permissive environments where this is what's done, within the family or within the larger, culture. Those are the really, really big issues. If I could get the country to do one thing and one thing only, it would be to spend 1 minute going through the DSM-5 for addiction. You can find it on Very Well Mind, or you could find it at addictionlessons.com. I believe it's lesson 2. But it's 11 yes or no behavioral health questions that will tell you if there's a problem or no problem. And it just cuts through all the excuses, the BS, the this, the that, right? It just tells you. And the thing was, I didn't know for sure that my son had an addiction. It may sound crazy, but I didn't know for sure until 4 years later, when I was at Harvard and every class mentioned the DSM-5. And I finally took the test as if my son was 16 again, and he had 10 of 11 symptoms. He had severe addiction. And so 1 minute, DSM-5 addiction, Very Well Mind, or addictionlessons.com. You can find it there. And it just cuts through all the garbage and it tells you what you're dealing with. And once you know what you're dealing with, that's half the game. When parents call me, they describe, to ask me about, what they should do. They describe a kid who's really, really sick with addiction. And I always ask, are you sure it's addiction? And 100% of the time they say, no, we're not sure. So then we go through the DSM-5 and I'm like, well, guess what? I'm sure.
And it's important to be sure, right? Because you got all that hard work ahead. And now you can practice that detachment you mentioned before, right? Because you understand the situation and you can go on loving your kid while hating the disease.
Exactly. And the thing is, the DSM-5 is not just made up thing. It's the gold standard diagnostic from the American Psychiatric Association. So it's a real thing.
So Steve, to wrap some of this up and get back to the optimism side of this, it's remarkable to hear your story and so heartwarming to know how Stevie is doing now. I'd like to ask how it feels for you. You're incredibly energetic, incredibly bright, as you said, very well educated. You loved your job at Morgan Stanley. What's a day like for you now in terms of your purpose, what you feel like you're accomplishing? Not that there's anything wrong with working at Morgan Stanley, but how do you feel as a human being now doing this work?
Great question. So I loved Morgan Stanley. I loved being on the trading floor. It was an incredible environment for me. It did a lot of great things for me. But I feel like my son handed me a gift. And the gift is that I got to learn something completely new that is so useful to so many people. And that is the insights around addiction and insights around being a parent of someone with this problem, and the capabilities of sharing it in a scalable way. It's changed me personally. I'm much more willing to show vulnerability. I never was before. I was the badass trader on the floor running the biggest business, and that was a persona. Now I'm willing to tell people, yeah, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was a mess. I got lucky. You know, so all of those things are part of my lexicon now. And I just feel like, there was a plan for me, and, I'm a better human in a lot of ways. I feel better about my days. They're not as jam packed as they were, but I do a lot of volunteer work. I'm open to helping anybody at any time. I mean, back working on Wall Street, you have certain things that measure your performance. Now I measure my week in how many hours am I spending helping other people. That's my new metric. And I love the metric. And I'm fortunate. I mean, I have to be, working on Wall Street gives you certain, ability to retire, at a certain age. But that's my new metric, and I love the metric.
Well, Steve, of course, I'm sorry for your family and that you had to go through all this. But at the same time, I'm so glad that you've come out the other side the way you have, and you're making this difference in the world. And I can tell anyone listening, I spent the 40 minutes reading your essays on addictionlessons.com, and I have not dealt with this personally, thank goodness, but they really impacted me. So thanks for all you're doing. I really appreciate you spending time with me on the podcast, and keep up the great work. Thank you so much.
Well, Bill, it's been my pleasure. And I think what you're doing is great because the world needs optimism. I think it's one of the most underrated gifts. When people feel good and feel optimistic, there's nothing better. So thank you.
Thanks. Take care. The statistics around the age of first use are really striking. And as Steve said, it's easy to find the DSM-5 survey online, including at Steve's own addictionlessons.com website. And back to where I started with Steve, talking about his optimistic nature, his ability to look back now and say that his son gave him a gift is amazing. Likewise, hearing him talk about how his favorite new metric is how many hours he spends helping others is heartwarming. I hope you enjoyed this blue sky conversation with Steve D. And also that if you have concerns about anyone in your life who might be battling addiction, that you'll check out the resources and recommendations he made here today. And if you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing to Blue Sky so you don't miss any future episodes. And follow the Optimism Institute on social media. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.